A ruthless judge known for his iron fist approach to justice faces his most challenging case when a humble waitress refuses to accept her fate, forcing him to confront everything he believes about truth, mercy, and the real meaning of justice. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments what you think makes a good judge. Someone who follows the law strictly, or someone who considers the human side of every case? At the end, rate this story from 1 to 10 and let us know your thoughts. Now let's begin. The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Hamilton County Courthouse as Judge William Harrison adjusted his black robes and prepared for what he assumed would be another routine sentencing. At 52, Harrison had built his reputation on one simple principle. The law was sacred, and emotion had no place in his courtroom. For 15 years, he had been known as the Iron Judge, a man who never wavered, never showed mercy beyond what the statutes required, and never let sentiment cloud his judgment. The defendant standing before him that gray October morning appeared unremarkable at first glance. Maria Santos, 34 years old, stood with her shoulders squared despite the worn public defender suit that hung loosely on her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her calloused hands, the hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life, gripped the defendant's table with quiet determination. The charges were serious: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, and resisting arrest. The victim was Police Sergeant Michael Patterson, a 20-year veteran of the force who now walked with a permanent limp thanks to the knife wound Maria had inflicted during what prosecutors called an unprovoked attack outside the Blue Moon Diner where she worked as a night shift waitress. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh stood at the prosecutor's table, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer suit immaculate despite the early hour. This case had become her stepping stone to higher office. The story of a hardworking police officer brutally attacked by an illegal immigrant had played well in the media, even though Maria's immigration status was actually legal. "Your Honor," DA Walsh began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never lost a high-profile case. Maria Santos viciously attacked Sergeant Patterson without provocation on the night of June 15th. The defendant used a kitchen knife from her workplace to stab a police officer who was simply doing his job. The evidence is overwhelming, the jury's verdict was unanimous, and the people demand justice. Judge Harrison nodded curtly. He had reviewed the case file thoroughly. The evidence seemed clear-cut. Security footage from the diner's parking lot showed Maria wielding a knife. Witness statements from other officers corroborated Sergeant Patterson's account of an unprovoked attack. And Maria herself had been found at the scene with blood on her hands and clothes. "Ms. Santos," Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of attempted murder in the first degree. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say to this court?" Maria lifted her chin, and something flickered in her brown eyes. Not defiance exactly, but a quiet strength that seemed oddly out of place for someone facing decades in prison. When she spoke, her accent was slight, her English careful but clear. "Your Honor, I know what the jury decided, but I need to say this. I did not attack Sergeant Patterson without reason. I was defending myself and my daughter. That man—" She paused, glancing at Patterson, who sat in the front row wearing his dress uniform, his medals catching the courtroom's fluorescent light. That man was not acting like a police officer that night. He was acting like a predator. A murmur rippled through the packed gallery. Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. He'd heard this story before. Criminals trying to justify their violence by attacking the character of their victims, especially police officers. It was a defense as old as the criminal justice system itself. "Ms. Santos, you were found in possession of a deadly weapon, covered in Sergeant Patterson's blood. The security footage clearly shows you attacking him. These are facts, not opinions." Harrison leaned forward, his presence imposing despite his medium build. "Your attempt to malign the character of a decorated police officer will not change the reality of your actions." Maria's public defender, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who had been handling cases for 30 years, rose weakly to his feet. "Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence regarding the attempted murder charge. We believe the evidence shows she was acting in self-defense." "Sit down, Mr. Chen." Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "The jury has spoken. They saw the same evidence you did and reached a unanimous verdict. I will not allow this courtroom to become a platform for baseless accusations against a law enforcement officer who nearly lost his life in the line of duty." But Maria Santos was not finished. She took a step forward, ignoring the bailiff's warning gesture. "Your Honor, My daughter Isabella was working with me that night. She's 16 years old, and she was closing the kitchen while I finished serving the last customers. Sergeant Patterson came into the diner at 11:45 p.m. after we were supposed to be closed. He said he needed to check on things, but there was something wrong with the way he looked at Isabella, the way he talked to her. Judge Harrison felt a flicker of irritation. This woman was going to force him to listen to a fabricated sob story, wasting the court's time with lies designed to generate sympathy. Ms. Santos, the court has reviewed the timeline of events. Sergeant Patterson was conducting a routine safety check, something he had done monthly for over 2 years without incident. Your attack on him was unprovoked and... He cornered Isabella in the storage room. Maria's voice rose slightly, breaking through Harrison's speech. He told her she was developing nicely and asked if she wanted to earn some extra money. When I found them, his hand was on her shoulder, and she was pressed against the wall, terrified. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sergeant Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing red. D.A. Walsh jumped to her feet. Objection! Your Honor, this is character assassination of the victim. There is no evidence to support these allegations, and they were not part of the trial proceedings. Harrison banged his gavel hard. Sustained. Ms. Santos, you will limit your remarks to accepting responsibility for your actions, not manufacturing excuses. But something in Maria's eyes stopped him cold. There was no calculation there, no cunning attempt at manipulation. There was only the desperate honesty of a mother who had fought to protect her child. I asked him to leave, Maria continued, her voice steady despite the judge's warning. I told him the diner was closed and that Isabella was just a child.
He laughed and said I should be grateful for his attention, that illegal immigrants like me should know better than to make trouble for American cops. Ms. Santos, I'm warning you, I'm not illegal. Maria's composure cracked for the first time. I've been a legal resident for 12 years. I pay taxes. I work 60 hours a week to support my daughter. But he called me illegal, threatened to have me deported, said no one would believe a wetback over a decorated police officer.
The slur hung in the air like a physical presence. Even Judge Harrison felt its impact, though he quickly buried the reaction beneath years of judicial training. He followed us to the parking lot, Maria continued, tears beginning to stream down her face. Isabella was so scared she was shaking. He said if I didn't want trouble, I should send Isabella to his car for a few minutes. He said it would be educational for her. The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. That's when I picked up the knife from my apron. I had been cleaning the kitchen and forgot to put it back. I told him to stay away from my daughter. He laughed and reached for Isabella again. And Maria's voice broke completely. I couldn't let him hurt my baby. I couldn't. Judge Harrison studied Maria's face carefully. In 15 years on the bench, he had developed an instinct for detecting lies, and everything about Maria Santos suggested she was telling the truth. The pain in her eyes was too raw, too genuine to be manufactured. But the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, witness testimony, physical evidence. It all pointed to an unprovoked attack on a police officer. Personal feelings couldn't override facts, and facts were what mattered in his courtroom. Ms. Santos, Harrison said finally, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. I understand you believe you were protecting your daughter, but the law cannot operate on beliefs or feelings. The evidence shows that you attacked Sergeant Patterson with a deadly weapon causing serious bodily harm. Regardless of your motivations, your actions constituted attempted murder under the laws of this state. Maria nodded slowly, her tears still falling. I understand, Your Honor. But I need you to know that if I had to do it again, if someone threatened my Isabella like that, I would make the same choice. A mother's job is to protect her children, whatever the cost. Something twisted in Harrison's chest. An unfamiliar sensation that felt almost like doubt. He pushed it down, focusing on the facts, the evidence, the law. Maria Santos, he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Having been found guilty by a jury of your peers of attempted murder in the first degree, I hereby sentence you to 12 years in the state penitentiary, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. You are also ordered to pay restitution for Sergeant Patterson's medical expenses and court costs. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Maria's knees buckled slightly, and her lawyer reached out to steady her. In the gallery, a teenage girl with Maria's eyes and delicate features began to sob. Isabella Santos, watching her mother disappear into the criminal justice system. But as the bailiffs moved to escort Maria away, she turned back one final time. Her eyes met Judge Harrison's across the courtroom, and in that moment, something passed between them that would haunt Harrison for months to come. "Your Honor," Maria said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the courtroom's chaos, "I pray that you never have to choose between the law and protecting someone you love, because when that moment comes, you'll understand why I did what I did." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. He watched as Maria was led away in shackles, her head held high despite her circumstances. Isabella's cries pierced the air as court officers restrained her from following her mother. As the courtroom cleared, Harrison remained seated, staring at the empty defendant's table. For the first time in his career, he felt something he'd never experienced before: uncertainty about whether justice had truly been served. That evening, Harrison sat in his study with a glass of bourbon, reviewing the Santos case file for the third time. The evidence was overwhelming, the verdict was correct, and his sentence fell within established guidelines. By every legal measure, justice had been served. So why couldn't he shake the image of Maria Santos's eyes? Why did her words about choosing between law and love keep echoing in his mind? His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Detective Linda Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the force whom Harrison had known since her rookie days. "Judge Harrison? I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted to talk to you about the Santos case." Harrison straightened in his chair. "What about it, Detective?" "Well, sir, I was part of the team that investigated the incident, and I've been troubled by some aspects of the case. There are inconsistencies that have been bothering me." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Morrison's voice was cautious, the tone of someone who knew she was walking on dangerous ground. "For starters, the security footage from the diner's parking lot. The angle is wrong to show what actually happened before the stabbing. All we can see is Maria with the knife, but we can't see what prompted her to pick it up." Harrison felt his stomach tighten. "The investigation was thorough, Detective. The evidence was presented to the jury." "That's just it, Judge. I'm not sure it was thorough enough. We focused on the assault itself, but we never really investigated Maria's claims about what happened inside the diner. We took Sergeant Patterson's word that he was conducting a routine safety check, but what? But I've been looking into Sergeant Patterson's history, and there are some red flags. 3 complaints filed against him over the past 5 years, all from Hispanic women, all claiming inappropriate behavior. The complaints were all dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the pattern is troubling." Harrison set down his bourbon with a trembling hand. "Why wasn't this brought up during the investigation?" "Because those files are confidential, and we weren't looking for patterns. We were investigating an assault on a police officer, not misconduct by the officer himself. But Judge, if Maria Santos was telling the truth about what happened in that diner, the implication hung in the air between them. If Maria had been telling the truth, then Harrison had just sentenced an innocent woman to 12 years in prison for protecting her daughter from a sexual predator. Detective Morrison, I need you to be very careful about what you're suggesting. Sergeant Patterson is a decorated officer with 20 years of service. I understand that, sir. But I've also seen what happens when we don't ask the hard questions. I think this case deserves another look." After Morrison hung up, Harrison sat alone in his study, surrounded by law books and judicial awards that suddenly felt meaningless. For 15 years, he had prided himself on his unwavering commitment to the law, his ability to see through emotional manipulation and focus on facts. But what if the facts he'd relied on were incomplete? What if Maria Santos hadn't been manipulating him with a false story, but desperately trying to tell him the truth? Harrison opened his laptop and pulled up the state prison database. Maria Santos, inmate number 674298, was currently housed at Riverside Correctional Facility for Women, an hour north of the city. According to her record, she had been a model prisoner since her arrival. No infractions, enrolled in educational programs, working in the prison kitchen. He closed the laptop and walked to his window, gazing out at the city lights. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to pursue Detective Morrison's concerns or file them away as the doubts of a well-meaning officer. But tonight, he could only sit with the growing realization that he might have made the most devastating mistake of his career. Somewhere in a prison cell an hour away, Maria Santos was probably lying awake on a narrow bunk, wondering if her daughter was safe, if Isabella was managing in foster care, if she would ever see her child grow up. She was serving time for protecting her daughter, sacrificed on the altar of Harrison's absolute faith in the system. 3 weeks later, Harrison found himself doing something he'd never done in 15 years on the bench, visiting a defendant he'd sentenced. The meeting had taken weeks to arrange, requiring special permissions and waivers, but Harrison's growing doubts had left him no choice. The prison's visiting room was a sterile space painted in institutional beige, filled with plastic chairs and tables bolted to the floor. Harrison waited at a corner table, watching as other inmates met with their families. Tearful reunions, hushed conversations, the desperate intimacy of people whose time together was measured and monitored. When Maria walked through the security door, Harrison was struck by how prison had changed her. She was thinner, her dark hair now streaked with premature gray, but it was her eyes that told the real story. The quiet strength was still there, but it was wrapped now in a wariness that came from surviving in a world where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She sat across from him without speaking, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Ms. Santos," Harrison began, then stopped. The formal address felt absurd given the circumstances. "Maria, I wanted to speak with you about your case." "Has something changed?" Her voice was hoarser than he remembered, roughened by months of institutional air and suppressed emotion. Harrison chose his words carefully. "There are some questions that have come to light about the investigation. Questions about what really happened that night at the diner." Maria studied his face for a long moment. "You mean you're finally ready to listen to what I tried to tell you in your courtroom?" The simple statement cut deeper than any accusation could have. Harrison felt his throat tighten. "Tell me what happened. All of it. From the beginning." Maria leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as she remembered that night 6 months ago. "Isabella and I were closing the Blue Moon like we did every night. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes and putting equipment away. I was wiping down tables and counting the till." Her voice was steady, but Harrison could see the effort it took to revisit these memories. "Sergeant Patterson came in around 11:45. The door should have been locked, but sometimes we forgot to turn the deadbolt while we were still cleaning up. He said he was conducting a safety check, asked if we were having any problems with customers or break-ins." Maria paused, her hands clenching slightly. "At first, everything seemed normal. He'd done these checks before, always professional, always respectful. But that night was different. He kept looking at Isabella, watching her as she worked. There was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable." "What did you do?" "I told him we were fine, that we'd be leaving soon. I hoped he'd take the hint and go. But instead, he asked Isabella to show him the storage room, said he needed to check that the back door was secure." Maria's voice began to shake. "I didn't think anything of it at first. It was a reasonable request. But when they didn't come back after a few minutes, I got worried." Harrison leaned forward. "What did you find when you went looking for them?" Isabella was pressed against the wall, and Sergeant Patterson was standing very close to her. Too close. His hand was on her shoulder, and he was saying something about how much she'd grown up, how pretty she was becoming. Isabella looked terrified. The pain in Maria's voice was palpable now. "I asked him to step away from my daughter. I told him she was only 16, that she needed to get home to finish her homework. He laughed and said Isabella was old enough to know how the world worked, that girls like her needed to learn to be friendly with men in positions of power." Harrison felt a cold sensation in his stomach. "What happened next?" "He told me I should be grateful he was taking an interest in Isabella, that Mexican girls like her didn't usually get such opportunities. When I told him we weren't Mexican, we're from Guatemala, he just shrugged and said it didn't matter, that all illegals looked the same to him." Maria's composure was beginning to crack. "I told him again that we were legal residents, that we'd been here for 12 years. He said papers didn't matter, that he could make problems for us anytime he wanted. Then he asked Isabella if she'd like to earn some money, said she could come sit in his patrol car for a few minutes." "And that's when you got the knife?" "I was already carrying it. I'd been using it to cut fruit for the dessert display and had stuck it in my apron when I started cleaning. When he reached for Isabella again, when she tried to back away and he grabbed her arm." Maria's voice broke completely. "I told him to let go of my daughter. I told him to leave us alone. He said I was making a mistake, that no one would believe a wetback over a cop." Harrison closed his eyes, remembering his own dismissal of Maria's story in the courtroom. "What made you actually use the knife?" "He shoved me aside and grabbed Isabella by both shoulders. He said he was going to teach her some manners, that she needed to learn respect for authority. Isabella was crying, begging him to stop, and I couldn't let him hurt my baby. I pulled out the knife and told him to get away from her. The prosecution claimed you attacked him unprovoked." Maria's laugh was bitter. "He lunged at me when I showed him the knife, said I was threatening a police officer, that he could shoot me and no one would question it. We struggled, and the knife went into his leg. It was an accident. I was trying to get him away from Isabella, not to hurt him." Harrison stared at the table between them, trying to reconcile Maria's account with the version of events he'd accepted at trial. "Why didn't your lawyer present this version of events more effectively?" Mr. Chen tried, but no one wanted to listen. The other officers who arrived on scene backed up Sergeant Patterson's story. They said he was conducting a routine safety check when I attacked him without warning. The security footage only showed the parking lot, not what happened inside the diner. What about Isabella? Didn't she testify? Maria's eyes filled with tears. She was too scared. The prosecutor said if she lied to protect me, she could be charged as an accessory. She's just a child, Judge Harrison. She's been through enough. Harrison felt the full weight of what Maria was telling him. If her story was true, and everything about her demeanor suggested it was, then he had sentenced an innocent woman to 12 years in prison for protecting her daughter from sexual assault. "Maria, why didn't you tell me all of this in court? When I asked if you had anything to say before sentencing." "I tried to," she said simply. "But you didn't want to hear it. You'd already decided I was guilty, that I was lying to avoid responsibility. You saw a poor Latina woman who had hurt a white police officer, and that was all you needed to see." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow because they were true. He had dismissed Maria's attempts to explain because they didn't fit his preconceived notion of the case. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so very sorry." Maria studied his face for a long moment. "Judge Harrison, I don't need your apology. I need my freedom. I need to be with my daughter who's been in foster care since I was arrested. I need my life back." Harrison nodded, understanding the magnitude of what needed to happen. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make this right, Maria. I'm going to get you out of here." "And Sergeant Patterson? What happens to him?" Harrison met her eyes directly. "If what you've told me is true, then he's going to face justice for what he did to you and Isabella."
Real justice, not the perverted version I delivered in my courtroom. As Maria was escorted back to her cell, Harrison remained seated at the plastic table, surrounded by the sounds of the prison. Metal doors slamming, guards calling out instructions, the echo of footsteps on concrete floors. For the first time in his career, he understood that the law without compassion, without the willingness to seek the whole truth, was not justice at all.
It was just another form of oppression, and he had become its willing instrument. That night, Harrison called Detective Morrison and told her to reopen the Santos case. He also placed a call to the State Attorney General's office, requesting a formal investigation into Sergeant Patterson's conduct. But most importantly, he began the complex legal process of overturning Maria's conviction, something that would require him to admit publicly that he had been catastrophically wrong. As he worked through the night, drafting motions and reviewing statutes, Harrison thought about Maria's words, that he might someday have to choose between the law and protecting someone he loved. He was beginning to understand that sometimes the most just thing a judge could do was admit that justice had not been served and find the courage to start over in pursuit of the truth. For 15 years, William Harrison had been known as the Iron Judge. But iron, he was learning, could be brittle. Sometimes what looked like strength was actually inflexibility, and sometimes what appeared to be justice was simply the law being used to avoid the harder work of understanding human truth. The real test of a judge, Harrison now understood, was not how unflinchingly he could apply the law, but how humbly he could seek justice when the law had failed to deliver it. 2 weeks after his prison visit with Maria, Judge Harrison sat in his chambers reviewing a stack of files that would change everything he thought he knew about the Santos case. Detective Morrison had been thorough in her reinvestigation, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. "Judge Harrison?" Morrison knocked on his door, her expression grim. "I have the results of our expanded investigation into Sergeant Patterson." Harrison gestured for her to sit. Over the past weeks, Morrison had become his closest ally in unraveling the truth, despite the professional risks she was taking by challenging a decorated officer. "What did you find?" Morrison opened a thick folder, revealing photographs, witness statements, and internal police reports. "It's worse than we thought. We found 7 women over the past 5 years who had encounters with Patterson that match Maria's description. All Hispanic women, all working late-night shifts, all too scared to file formal complaints." Harrison felt his stomach clench. 7 women? 3 waitresses, 2 hotel housekeepers, a gas station attendant, and a convenience store clerk. Patterson would show up during late-night safety checks and make inappropriate advances. When they resisted, he'd threaten them with deportation, arrest, or having their children taken away by social services. My God, why didn't they report it? Morrison's expression was pained. Because they knew no one would believe them over a police officer. And because Patterson was smart, he targeted women who were vulnerable, who had something to lose. Women with children, women with uncertain immigration status, women who couldn't afford to fight back. Harrison stared at the files, each one representing a woman who had been victimized not just by Patterson, but by a system that had failed to protect her. What changed with Maria Santos? Maria was different. She wasn't undocumented, wasn't afraid of deportation, and more importantly, she had Isabella with her. When Patterson threatened her daughter directly, Morrison shrugged. That was a line Maria wouldn't let him cross. Harrison picked up one of the witness statements. This woman, Carmen Rodriguez, she works at the same diner. Night shift, just like Maria. Patterson approached her 3 months before the Santos incident. Same pattern? Inappropriate comments, unwanted touching, threats when she resisted. But Carmen has 2 young sons and no legal status. She was too terrified to fight back. The implications hit Harrison like a physical blow. Carmen could have corroborated Maria's story at trial, if she'd felt safe enough to testify. But the prosecutor never even interviewed her. They accepted Patterson's version of events and built their case around physical evidence that didn't tell the whole story. Harrison stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the city where 7 women had been terrorized by a man sworn to protect and serve. What about Patterson's fellow officers? Did they know? That's the most disturbing part. Morrison's voice was heavy. At least 3 officers suspected something was wrong. They'd heard rumors, noticed patterns, but nobody wanted to be the one to accuse a 20-year veteran. The blue wall of silence protected Patterson, and women like Maria paid the price. Harrison turned back to face Morrison. Where do we stand legally? Can we overturn Maria's conviction? With this new evidence, absolutely. Patterson's pattern of behavior establishes his credibility is compromised. More importantly, we found something else. Morrison pulled out a manila envelope. The security footage from the diner's interior. Harrison's heart stopped. I thought there were no interior cameras. That's what we were told. But I went back and checked personally. There's a camera above the cash register that covers the dining area and part of the kitchen. The recording system was damaged in a break-in 2 weeks after the incident, but the cloud backup wasn't destroyed. Morrison opened her laptop and turned it toward Harrison. Judge, you need to see this. The footage was grainy and dark, but clear enough to see the interior of the Blue Moon Diner on the night of June 15th. Harrison watched as Maria wiped down tables while Isabella worked in the visible portion of the kitchen. At 11:47 p.m., Sergeant Patterson entered through the front door. For the first few minutes, everything appeared normal. Patterson spoke with Maria, who pointed toward the back of the restaurant. Then both Patterson and Isabella disappeared from view, presumably heading toward the storage room. Harrison leaned forward, watching intently. At 11:52 p.m., Maria looked toward the back of the restaurant with obvious concern. She set down her cleaning supplies and walked out of camera range. 30 seconds later, all 3 figures returned to the main dining area. What Harrison saw next made his blood run cold. Patterson had his hand on Isabella's shoulder, and the 16-year-old was clearly trying to pull away. Maria stepped between them, gesturing for Patterson to back off. The officer's body language became aggressive, his finger pointing accusingly at Maria. Can you enhance the audio? Harrison asked, though he could already see the story playing out in Maria's movements and expressions. The system doesn't record audio, but watch this part. Morrison fast-forwarded slightly. This is when Patterson grabs Isabella's arm. Harrison watched as Patterson reached for the teenager, saw Maria push between them, saw the officer shove Maria aside roughly. Isabella was clearly crying now, her face turned away from Patterson as she tried to escape toward the kitchen. And here, Morrison said quietly, is when Maria shows him the knife. On screen, Maria pulled something from her apron, the kitchen knife she'd been using for prep work. She held it defensively, not threateningly, creating a barrier between Patterson and her daughter. Patterson's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged toward Maria, and both figures disappeared from camera view as they moved toward the exit. Harrison sat back in his chair, feeling the full weight of what he'd done to Maria Santos. The footage completely corroborated her version of events, showing a mother desperately trying to protect her child from a sexual predator. Linda, he said quietly, using Morrison's first name for the first time. How long has this footage existed? Since the night of the incident. The prosecutor's office requested all security footage, but somehow this backup was overlooked. Whether by accident or design, she shrugged meaningfully. Harrison felt a cold rage building in his chest. You think D.A. Walsh knew about this footage? I think DA Walsh knew enough to not look too hard for evidence that might complicate her case. Patterson was a sympathetic victim, Maria was an easy target, and a conviction looked good for her political ambitions. What about the other officers who arrived on scene? They all corroborated Patterson's story. Morrison's expression darkened. That's where it gets really ugly. Officers Brady, Chen, and Williams all filed reports stating that they arrived to find Patterson bleeding in the parking lot after an unprovoked attack. But I found something interesting in the dispatch records. She pulled out another file. The first 911 call came in at 12:03 a.m. A neighbor reported screaming from the diner parking lot. But Patterson didn't radio for backup until 12:07 a.m., 4 minutes later. What was he doing for those 4 minutes? Harrison studied the timeline. Coaching his story with the responding officers? That's my theory. By the time backup arrived, Patterson had crafted a narrative that painted him as the victim and Maria as an unstable woman who attacked without provocation. The other officers took his word for it and filed their reports accordingly. Harrison felt sick. The conspiracy of silence hadn't been passive. It had been active, deliberate, designed to protect Patterson and destroy Maria's credibility. Linda, I need you to do something for me. I want you to arrange a meeting with Isabella Santos. She's been in foster care since Maria's arrest, and I need to hear her side of the story. Are you sure? She's been through a tremendous trauma. Dredging this up again, she's the only witness to what really happened in that storage room. And if we're going to get justice for Maria, Isabella's testimony might be crucial. 3 days later, Harrison found himself in the office of Sarah Mitchell, Isabella's social worker, preparing to meet the girl whose life had been shattered by his pursuit of what he'd thought was justice. Isabella Santos, now 17, sat across from him with the same quiet dignity he'd seen in her mother. But her dark eyes held a wariness that no child should possess. Isabella, Harrison began gently, I want you to know that I've learned some things about what happened that night at the diner. Things that change everything about your mother's case. Isabella studied his face for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Are you going to let my mom come home? I'm working on that. But first, I need to understand what really happened. I need you to tell me about Sergeant Patterson. Isabella's composure wavered slightly. Do I have to? Sarah Mitchell leaned forward. Isabella, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. But Judge Harrison is trying to help your mother. Isabella looked between them, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, she nodded. What do you want to know? Tell me about that night. What happened when Sergeant Patterson asked you to show him the storage room? Isabella's hands clenched in her lap. He said he needed to check that the back door was secure, that there had been break-ins in the area. At first, it seemed normal. He'd done safety checks before. But something changed? When we got to the storage room, he closed the door behind us. He said I'd grown up a lot since he'd last seen me, that I was becoming a beautiful young woman. The way he said it, Isabella shivered. It didn't feel like a compliment. Harrison kept his voice gentle. What happened next? He asked if I had a boyfriend, if I was dating anyone. When I said no, he smiled and said that was good, that young girls like me needed to be careful about the kind of men we trusted. Then he touched my shoulder and said I looked tense, that he could help me relax. Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper now. He started rubbing my shoulders, standing really close behind me. I tried to move away, but he put his hands on my waist and said I didn't need to be shy, that he was just being friendly. Harrison felt his hands clenching into fists. Did you call for your mother? I was too scared. He was a police officer. I thought I was supposed to do what he said. But when he started talking about how I could make some extra money if I was nice to him, I knew something was wrong. I tried to leave, but he grabbed my arm and said we weren't done talking. That's when your mother found you? Isabella nodded, tears beginning to fall. Mom came looking for me when we didn't come back. When she saw him holding my arm, saw how scared I was, she got really angry. She told him to let go of me, to leave me alone. What did Sergeant Patterson do? He laughed and said Mom was overreacting, that he was just giving me some friendly advice, but he didn't let go of my arm. He said girls like me needed to learn respect for authority, that my mother obviously hadn't taught me proper manners. Isabella's composure broke completely. He said he could teach me things my mother never could, that I should be grateful for his attention. When Mom told him to get away from me, he said she was making a big mistake, that nobody would believe a bunch of illegals over a decorated cop. Harrison handed Isabella a tissue, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. Isabella, I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened next. Mom pulled out the knife from her apron. She'd been cutting fruit earlier and forgot to put it away. She held it up and told Sergeant Patterson to back off, to leave us alone. She wasn't trying to attack him, she was just trying to protect me. And then, he got really angry. He said Mom was threatening a police officer, that he could arrest both of us for assaulting him. He lunged at her, trying to grab the knife, and they struggled. I was screaming, begging them to stop. Then there was blood, and Sergeant Patterson was on the ground. Isabella looked directly at Harrison. Judge Harrison, my mom saved me that night. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't fought back, I don't know what would have happened to me. Harrison felt the full weight of his failure settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Isabella, I need you to know that I was wrong. I was completely, devastatingly wrong about your mother. She's not a criminal. She's a hero. Then why is she still in prison? Because the system failed her. Because I failed her. But I'm going to fix this, Isabella. I'm going to bring your mother home. That evening, Harrison called an emergency meeting with DA Rebecca Walsh, Detective Morrison, and the Attorney General's office. The conference room in the courthouse was tense as Harrison laid out the evidence that would destroy several careers and overturn one of the county's highest-profile convictions. Rebecca, Harrison said, addressing the DA directly, we have a problem. The Santos case was built on fabricated evidence and witness perjury. Walsh's face flushed red. That's a serious accusation, Judge Harrison. The evidence was solid, the conviction was unanimous, the evidence was incomplete, and you know it. Harrison slid the security footage across the table. This interior camera footage existed from the beginning, but somehow never made it into evidence. Care to explain how that happened? Walsh watched the footage in silence, her political ambitions crumbling with each frame that showed Patterson's aggressive behavior toward Isabella Santos. This doesn't change anything, she said finally. Santos still attacked a police officer with a deadly weapon. Santos defended her 16-year-old daughter from sexual assault by a predator in uniform. Harrison's voice was ice cold. And your office conspired to cover it up because it was politically inconvenient to prosecute a cop. Assistant General Attorney David Park, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Judge Harrison, these are serious allegations. If what you're saying is true, we're looking at prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and a massive miscarriage of justice. That's exactly what I'm saying. Harrison turned to Detective Morrison. Tell them what else you found. Morrison opened her files. 7 other women with similar experiences with Sergeant Patterson, a pattern of sexual harassment and assault spanning 5 years, and evidence that multiple officers knew about Patterson's behavior but chose to protect him instead of his victims. The room was silent as the implications sank in. Walsh's career was over, Patterson would face federal charges, and several other officers would likely lose their jobs. What do you want? Walsh asked quietly. I want Maria Santos released immediately. I want all charges dropped. I want a formal apology from your office. And I want Sergeant Patterson arrested for sexual assault, official misconduct, and civil rights violations. Walsh nodded slowly. And if I refuse? Harrison smiled grimly. Then this all goes public tomorrow morning, and you can explain to the voters why you sent an innocent woman to prison to protect a sexual predator. How do you think that will play in next year's election? Within hours, the machinery of justice that had destroyed Maria Santos began working to restore her freedom. Emergency motions were filed, appeals were fast-tracked, and by the end of the week, Maria's conviction was officially overturned. But for Harrison, the real moment of reckoning came when he stood outside Riverside Correctional Facility, waiting for Maria to walk through those gates as a free woman. When Maria emerged, wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in 8 months earlier, she looked around the parking lot with the disorientation of someone whose world had been turned upside down. She spotted Isabella immediately. Her daughter had grown taller, looked older, carried herself with the premature maturity that comes from surviving trauma. Harrison watched from a distance as mother and daughter embraced, both of them crying, both of them trying to bridge 8 months of separation with a single moment of reunion. He didn't interrupt. This moment belonged to them. Later, after the tears and the initial reunion, Maria approached him. Judge Harrison, she said simply. Thank you. Maria, I don't deserve your thanks. I put you in that place. I believed lies over truth, politics over justice. I failed you in every possible way. Maria studied his face. But you didn't stop there. When you realized you were wrong, you didn't hide from it or try to justify it. You fixed it. That takes courage, too. Harrison felt his throat tighten. How can you forgive me? How can you be so gracious to someone who stole 8 months of your life? Because staying angry would steal even more of my life, Maria said simply. And because Isabella needs to see that people can change, that admitting mistakes is a strength, not a weakness. Over the following months, the Santos case became a watershed moment for criminal justice reform in Hamilton County. Sergeant Patterson was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. 3 other officers were fired for their role in the cover-up, and DA Rebecca Walsh resigned in disgrace. But the most significant change was in Judge William Harrison himself. The man who had once been known as the Iron Judge became something different, not softer necessarily, but more thoughtful, more willing to look beyond surface evidence to find the truth beneath. Harrison established a judicial review board to examine other cases where defendants claimed prosecutorial misconduct or police corruption. He instituted mandatory training for all court personnel on recognizing signs of witness intimidation and official misconduct. Most importantly, he learned to listen, really listen, when defendants tried to tell their side of the story. Maria Santos returned to work at the Blue Moon Diner, but only temporarily.
Within a year, she had enrolled in paralegal training, using her experience with the criminal justice system to help other families navigate legal challenges. Isabella, now 18, was accepted to college on a full scholarship, planning to study law with the goal of becoming a public defender. On the first anniversary of Maria's release, Harrison visited the Blue Moon Diner during his lunch break.
Maria served him coffee and a piece of apple pie, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a while. "Maria," Harrison said finally, "I need you to know that you changed me, not just as a judge, but as a person. You showed me that courage isn't about being tough or uncompromising. Real courage is about protecting what matters, even when the cost is everything." Maria smiled. "And you showed Isabella and me that the system isn't perfect, but it can work when good people are willing to fight for what's right. That's a lesson worth learning. What will you do now? With the settlement money from the lawsuit?" Maria's wrongful conviction lawsuit against the county had resulted in a substantial settlement, enough to secure her and Isabella's future. "Isabella's college is paid for. I'm buying a small house near the campus so she can live at home while she studies, and I'm starting a foundation to help other families who are dealing with false accusations and prosecutorial misconduct." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's perfect. You're turning your suffering into service for others. That's what my mother taught me. She used to say that God allows us to go through difficult things not to break us, but to prepare us to help others who face the same challenges." As Harrison prepared to leave, Maria handed him a wrapped package. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a framed photograph of Isabella in her high school graduation cap and gown, standing beside Maria outside the courthouse where Harrison had once sentenced her to 12 years in prison. Both women were smiling, their faces radiant with hope and possibility. On the back, Isabella had written, "To Judge Harrison, thank you for showing me that justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as good people keep fighting for truth. See you in law school. Isabella Santos, future public defender." Harrison felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he read the inscription. She's really going to be a lawyer? She says she wants to be the kind of lawyer who makes sure the next Maria Santos doesn't spend 8 months in prison for protecting her child. She wants to be the voice for people who aren't being heard. That evening, Harrison sat in his study, looking at the photograph Maria had given him. Isabella Santos, the scared 16-year-old he'd failed to protect, was now a confident young woman preparing to enter the same legal system that had nearly destroyed her family. But instead of seeking revenge, she was choosing service. Harrison thought about his legacy, about the cases he'd decided over 20 years on the bench. How many other Maria Santos had he failed to see? How many other Isabella Santos had suffered because he'd been too proud to question, too rigid to doubt, too concerned with appearing strong to show compassion? He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. Every case that came before him now was filtered through the lens of Maria's quiet dignity and Isabella's resilient hope. He asked harder questions, demanded better investigations, and never again dismissed a defendant's attempt to explain their actions. The legal community noticed the change. Some criticized Harrison for being soft, for showing too much concern for defendants' personal circumstances. But others recognized that he hadn't become weak. He'd become wise. He'd learned to balance justice with mercy, law with compassion, strength with humility. 3 years after Maria's release, Harrison received an invitation that filled him with pride. Isabella Santos was graduating from law school, and she wanted him to be there. The graduation ceremony was held in the same courthouse where Harrison had once sentenced Maria to prison. As Isabella walked across the stage to receive her law degree, Harrison caught Maria's eye in the audience. She smiled and mouthed, "Thank you." But Harrison shook his head slightly and mouthed back, "Thank you." Because the truth was, Maria and Isabella Santos had saved him just as much as he had eventually saved them. They had shown him that real strength wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about having the courage to admit them and the determination to make them right. After the ceremony, Isabella approached Harrison in her cap and gown, beaming with pride and possibility. "Judge Harrison, I want you to know that you're the reason I'm here today. Isabella, you're here because of your own hard work and your mother's sacrifice. I nearly derailed your future before it began. But you didn't let that be the end of the story. You taught me that the system can fail, but it can also heal. That justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever." She paused, her expression growing serious. "I start work next month as a public defender in this very courthouse. I'm going to be standing in your courtroom, advocating for people who need someone to believe their story." Harrison felt his heart swell with pride and hope. "I look forward to seeing you there, Counselor Santos. And I promise you this, every defendant who comes before me will be heard, really heard before judgment is passed." Isabella smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for, Your Honor. A fair hearing, a chance to tell their truth, and a judge who remembers that behind every case is a human being with a story worth understanding." As Harrison watched Isabella celebrate with her family, he reflected on the profound transformation that had begun with his catastrophic failure in Maria's case. He'd thought he was the teacher, the dispenser of justice, the one with all the answers. But Maria and Isabella had been his teachers, showing him that true justice required not just knowledge of the law, but wisdom about the human heart. The case that had nearly destroyed his faith in himself had ultimately restored it, teaching him that the measure of a judge wasn't how many convictions he secured or how tough his sentences were. The measure of a judge was how willing he was to seek truth over convenience, justice over politics, and humanity over rigid adherence to rules. Judge William Harrison was no longer known as the Iron Judge. Now he was simply known as a fair judge, a thoughtful judge, a judge who listened. And in a world where too many people went unheard, that reputation was worth more than any number of tough sentences or political accolades. The Santos case had been his toughest case, not because of its legal complexity, but because it had forced him to confront everything he thought he knew about justice, truth, and himself. In failing Maria Santos, he had discovered his own capacity for growth. In nearly destroying an innocent family, he had learned what it truly meant to serve justice. And in the end, that transformation had made him not just a better judge, but a better man. What an incredible journey of truth, courage, and redemption. A story that shows us how even our worst mistakes can become catalysts for positive change when we have the courage to face them honestly. What did you think about Isabella's decision to become a public defender in the same courthouse where her mother was wrongly convicted? Do you believe Judge Harrison truly redeemed himself through his actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 1 to 10. If this story of justice and second chances moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us that it's never too late to do the right thing.